Hey everybody, Ethan here from WordTech, and welcome to WordCast number 73. That is the second time in a row that I've gotten the number right, so I am again proud of myself. We've got a lot of interesting stuff for you guys today. It's going to be a little bit shorter than the last podcast because technical difficulties prevented us from starting for over an hour, but we think we have them worked out, so I'm sure whoever's watching this is going to know if we
In
have them
addition,
worked
it was
out.
also
But
a
anyway,
fairly light week except for the first topic, which is a pretty significant change, but it's also one of those things where stuff will have to play out. We'll have to see how it plays out in order to really know the full ramifications anyway. And
yes.
so going into only like a general detail explanation of it is fine anyway for this week. It's going to be an
Yeah,
ongoing
no,
discussion.
absolutely. And I mean, it yes. And it was a fairly dry week of anything major other than this. We have our second big section is just security, which is like, I mean, it's a bunch of little things that are considered one section. But then the rest of it is just kind of smaller little
Yeah.
tidbits here and there. So, a little bit of a dry week, but still a couple of important things to talk about, in particular this first one, which I will let Daniel, who I haven't said the name of yet, take
Yeah,
the lead on
so
that.
for those that haven't seen the feud between the President of the United States of America and Twitter, the social media platform that limits you to 280 characters, um, Trump and Twitter are not friends. Trump is a little mad at them because they fact checked the tweet of his. Now, we're not going to get too much into the general politics of it because this is a tech podcast. However, tech and politics are intertwined more than ever at this point and will continue to be so. So,
Well, yeah, and I mean, especially in the United States more than they used to be. I feel like other countries they were
yeah.
intertwined a little bit more previously, but
And in
now
addition
there's
to
just
that,
so
it's just going
much.
to grow more and more intertwined everywhere with AI, with deep fakes, with which we'll probably talk about next week, but like ever enhancing language algorithms like GPT, the third version, some details came out about. And so as this stuff becomes more of a big
Yeah,
deal, we're going to have to see how governments decide to regulate it and talk about it. Um, but there is something pretty fundamental to how the internet has worked so far, especially under US regulation, and that is Section 230 of the
yeah.
Communication Decency Act. This was a section written by two two people, a Democrat, our Senator Wyden, and a Republican House representative who I believe was from California, and I don't believe he's currently a um, don't believe he's currently in office. But yeah, so it was written bipartisanly, and the goal was to make it so that if you make a website that hosts other people's content, you're not liable for what they post. And that makes sense. That's how.
Which is important for like small time, especially. But I mean, in general, obviously that's important. But I feel like for small time stuff, that's
Yeah, I mean, it's
even more
fundamental to how
significant. You know what I mean?
everything from sites like Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube work to sites like local news outlets that have comment sections. Because while technically it's on the same site,
Yeah.
that comment section is treated as a platform because it's hosting other people's content. Um, and so
Right.
that has been a key thing in which if you post something on Twitter that potentially is um, so intentionally misleading against someone that a lawsuit could be filed, that lawsuit would be filed against the person that posted it, not on the platform. Without that, Reddit couldn't exist, Twitter couldn't exist, no site could host user content because you'd have to police literally everything.
And they can't police that hard. I mean, despite what some people like to think, the simple fact is that you can't do that level of policing even with
Yeah.
the best
And
machine learning right
in the
now.
context of what we're talking about
So
with this what we'll talk about with this change, if the goal is free speech, then we don't want them policing every single thing that gets posted on there. We only want them having to monitor and police the
yeah,
things that
yeah,
seem problematic. Um,
right,
yeah,
yeah,
so essentially
exactly.
what's
So
happening is Trump has signed an executive order targeting social media companies. Now, I read through the order. I am not a lawyer. Want to make that very clear that I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a whole lot of experience other than just reading some articles about Section 230 and about tech law. I do follow Wyden, who was one of the people that wrote this, because he is my senator, and so I have to decide whether or not I'm going to vote for him. And so what he does matters, and so I follow that. But outside of that, and other than when the topics come up, I don't generally pay that much attention to it. But I did read through the entirety of the executive order. The finalized one, not just the draft one, the finalized one was released today, which is, we're recording this on Thursday the 28th. So the order has been released, and essentially from what I'm, go ahead.
Um, I want to jump in here and just say also that I'm not a lawyer. I want to make that clear. And I also have not done the extensive research. I
Yeah.
did the security portion of the podcast. So I'm actually going to be learning kind of with you guys as Daniel talks about it. So everything that I say is opinion based on the information provided.
For reference, I think everyone should read the order. I feel like the first section is mostly just them setting up the legal grounds for why they think that this should stand. It's not really actual policy. So you'll notice that it's a lot more opinionated and a lot more like attacking Twitter and stuff like that in section 1. But once you get past that, that's where it more so goes into the policy changes that they are trying to achieve with this. And a lot of the
Okay.
policy changes are not actually policy changes now. They're more so directing other departments to look at policy changes, which means that the ramifications that we're going to see from this don't
Okay.
go into effect now. They won't go into effect for a while. It's going to be one of those things where there's going to be a lot of outrage now, and then things will die down, and then the actual changes will go into place, and then that's when the legal battles will start. Realistically, we're looking at least like 60 days before many of the actual even legal battles can begin in the courts, let alone,
It's kind of like
yeah.
net neutrality stuff
Um,
again. Like and not
yeah,
what this is, but the way it functions in
yeah.
terms of delays and stuff
So
like
one of the
that.
biggest things that this targets is the good faith section of Section 230. So Section 230 has a specific clause for how platform holders would handle deleting content or restricting access to content. And this is specifically, the idea is, if a platform holder is doing too much to affect the content on their site, then they're no longer a platform, they're a publisher, is generally the idea that they're trying to argue. And so specifically within Section 230, it only states that if they are deleting or restricting access. It does not state that you would be no longer applying with that good faith portion if you added a tag stating that something could be misleading and linked to another source as to how that might be misleading, which is what spurred all of this. And the good faith section, essentially, it would potentially put the FCC as the arbiter of good faith. Like, they get to then decide what is good faith and what is not. Whereas right now, if let's
Mm,
say you personally felt like, Facebook did something that was not within good faith of Section 230 against you in restricting access to your content, and you sued them, it would be then decided by the courts based on the context of the lawsuit. Whereas what this is doing is shifting the power, if it stands legal ground and actually passes, shifting power of what is
right.
determined as good faith to the FCC, which is the executive branch, which means the president. While the president wouldn't directly be controlling these, ultimately, especially as we've seen with this president, if they don't like a decision from someone, they'll just fire them and replace them. And so potentially, let's say in this case with Trump and Twitter, we'll keep it to the current context. If, let's say, Ajit Pai decided that Twitter did act within good faith, or just that within the good faith it didn't qualify for how the Section 230 rules lay out good faith, then he could just fire Ajit Pai, put someone else in, and then, because if this gets into effect, the courts will have already approved that the FCC can determine good faith, then he can just keep replacing people until he finds someone that will do that, at which point then they could sue Twitter, Facebook, whoever, in this case Twitter, and the courts will have already determined that the FCC can determine good faith, and therefore will have given up their ability to make that judgment in that time. That's how I read that, and that seems to me
So
to be a big shift of power from Congress, who wrote the bill, and the courts, who would currently uphold that, to the FCC.
okay, so So I guess two things that kind of click with me here is first that I want to just note that this, regardless of how you feel about the current president or anything like that, having that kind of power and that ability to replace people to make this kind of a change is already something
Yeah.
that nobody should have. So it's regardless of how you feel about any of it, it's giving an amount of legal power to somebody that shouldn't
Yeah,
necessarily
and
have the
for
power over
reference, real
that sort of
quick,
thing.
so this doesn't
And then the
affect the
second thing,
president's ability to get rid of someone. They already have that ability. My concern is that,
right? It's
yes,
just
when you're
because of where the
giving the
control is
power,
pushed.
taking it from the
Yeah.
courts and giving it to somebody that is under the control of the executive, you are then just giving the power to the executive.
Right, right. And then I guess my thing also is like the FCC doesn't
No.
need more control over this
And
stuff
what's
anyway. They already
interesting
have
too,
control over
I
too
would
much.
like to know what
So,
Ajit Pai really thinks of this, because Ajit Pai's whole thing since he got into power within the FCC has been making it so the FCC can't do anything. It seems like he got that job and was like, I don't want to do any actual work, so I'm just going to make it so the FCC has no power. And now they are putting an
right,
immense
right.
amount
Yeah,
of
yeah.
power and responsibility in the FCC's hands, because this would mean that the FCC would have to handle every bias claim for every website with any sort of user generated content. Tumblr, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Craigslist, local news outlets like KPTV for us. If I don't think, yeah,
That's
Yahoo.
so
Like
much
that
work,
is a massive bureaucratic undertaking.
as well as just
Yeah,
generally more control for the government over things on the internet, which is already a more significant
yeah,
issue than I think some people even realize, and it's something that kind of needs to be worked on. Is we like the abandonment
mhm,
of net neutrality and stuff is a huge issue, and we have
yeah.
seen ramifications from it, right? And
And so, like,
I I just don't I like the internet, at least for the time being, to be treated as a very low, very
yeah,
light regulation thing. And I feel like we're doing more and more. And regardless, this isn't the internet in terms of like obviously the infrastructure, but this is
yeah,
what is being run on the internet. And I feel like that is also an aspect when I say the internet, just to be
hmm,
clear, that's also an aspect that I feel like
yeah.
needs to be low regulation.
And
That's what I'm
realistically, like,
including that
there's
in
no
there.
way a service
Um,
that's like nonprofit like Wikipedia can operate under the risk of, if I go in there and edit Trump's page to say, Trump was the worst president ever, since he likes to say best, biggest, worst, littlest president. And if Trump
uh-huh.
then gets pissed off about the fact that I keep going back in and editing that, and he has shifted the responsibility onto the platform holder rather than the user, well then,
Yeah, then
well,
you're
for
not the one
one,
getting in trouble
yes,
for it. It'd
but more
be
so, Wikipedia would have to decide as soon as these rules go into effect how they're going to handle things, because if anyone can edit anything, or even just if most people can edit anything, and then if under the whim of, doesn't have to be this current president, it could be the next one, it could be the one after that, it could be 10 from now, but if under any future president or any future FCC commissioner, they decide, okay, we're going to say Wikipedia is now liable for the content that gets posted on their service, Wikipedia is done. Wikipedia
yeah, and they're
can't
already
afford to
hurting.
police stuff like that, and they would have to do it from the moment the policy is put into place, not from the moment that the FCC commissioner decides that they are no longer in good faith, because they need to ensure that they stay in good faith. So it's just a big mess for
Yeah, so
nonprofits.
that's already a big problem there because that's yeah, that's already starting to damage some of the,
Mhm.
the freedom of
Yeah,
information on the internet at that point. I mean, it's affecting things that it's not even
yeah,
directly supposed to be affecting, right? Again, like
mhm,
freedom of information, which has been an important thing on the internet. I mean, I feel like we have so many people today that are smarter because of the internet,
mhm,
and not just because they're interested in the internet, but things that are completely unrelated because of things like forums,
yeah,
things like Wikipedia and other wikis and stuff. And when you start placing that responsibility on the which I have total deja vu with placing the
yeah,
responsibility of stuff on the platform holder, because that has come up in other policies. You start to put these businesses and these
mhm.
sites in a really weird situation where they're not really capable of doing anything other than closing because they can't
And, like,
afford to
this
be
puts a
liable for that information.
huge, um, like a huge risk on so many things people don't think about. Like, yeah, sure, you'd expect everything that's like what you'd expect for user content like Twitter and Wikipedia and stuff. But like GitHub is user content. So if somebody decides to post some sketchy stuff on there hidden as code or anything, well, potentially the FCC could determine that they didn't act in good faith arbitrarily because it's now up to the FCC for some reason. And like GitHub could be at risk, Stack Overflow could be at
Yeah.
risk. It could fundamentally change software development inadvertently if 3-4 FCC commissioners from now they run into some weirdest situation. Like there's so many things that Section 230 has been monumentally important towards allowing to exist. It is the sole reason user content exists
Yeah.
on the internet. It is the only law that gives any protection for platform holders. And so any kind of change to it is something that needs to be done very carefully and thoughtfully. And instead, what's happening here is it's just being done arbitrarily by the president who didn't put the law into effect, so he shouldn't potentially be able to do it. That's the one thing, is that because of that, and the only reason I'm bringing that part up as it dives more into the politics side, is that it could prevent it from this executive order from standing. Because Congress passed the law,
Right.
and he is now changing definitions and changing how the law works under an executive action, not a congressional one. It's not like he's implementing
Right. Right.
new, unique regulation under executive order. He's changing a congressional act.
Yeah. Right. Which is yeah, okay. I'm obviously a little bit
Yeah.
wordless here.
Oh, go ahead if you have something to add.
I mean, yeah.
So
No, no,
something
no,
else I was
you
gonna
go right
say.
ahead.
So some other things that make this kind of weird is that, like, as I was going through this, so some of the stuff is extremely concerning, like how it affects Section 230. However, some things don't even seem to really do much. Like they start to talk about how, and in fact, some stuff might give companies more power that inadvertently. So there's a section in
Hmm.
here about how some of this stuff, um, would just really like to kind of be exempt, not for like the Section 230 stuff, but for some of the stuff within this order, they would seemingly just have to
Right.
either give advanced notice about the changes, but they don't specify what would be considered adequate notice. So does that mean if Twitter wants to change their terms and conditions one day in advance, that's fine? Does it mean a month? They don't specify. But then it also states that
Hmm.
it would also be fine if they gave a reason to notice for like banning the content, which most every service does give you a reason, or they give you
Yeah.
some method of or ability to be heard is how it's worded, which to me seems like, if your concern is that like if you feel like you were banned invalidly and all that you have to do in order for that to be allowed, like for like let's say Facebook to ban people for whatever reason they want, is for people to be able to be heard and like contest that, well then Facebook's potential, like Facebook, for those that don't know, is creating something akin to a Supreme Court of speech on Facebook. And so the idea is
Yeah.
that whenever there is a dispute about something that happens on Facebook, initially it's just going to be bans. So in the initial cases, if there's a dispute about somebody getting banned from Facebook, it would escalate up to this Supreme Court of speech, as a lot of people are calling it. And so if all that you have to do to be able to ban people for whatever reason you want is have something like a Supreme Court of speech that you dictate the rules for, then it seems like it's giving Facebook a fuckload of power.
Well, I think that Facebook needs more power. They're too small
Yeah.
right now.
And so it's like
So I
that
think that's an
part
okay
just
decision.
didn't, I feel like, have enough information and needs to be clarified more, because if Facebook can say, oh,
Yeah.
we don't like this specific politician, we're going to ban everything about them, and we'll just say it's in our terms and conditions that we can do that. And like, as long as you escalate it to our court and our court says, yeah, it's in the terms and conditions, that's fine. Now, obviously, that's not something I expect to happen in that case, but I wanted to show an extreme example of how this could be used, because it's just weird how it gives
Yeah.
no further clarification, and it seems to just give an arbitrary power to social media. And it would give a lot of power to Facebook more than anyone else, because most places, like, yeah, Facebook can afford to do it. Google for YouTube could afford to do it. But like Twitter probably can't. Twitter's not very profitable, for those that don't know.
Well, and even then, I mean, the only reason YouTube would be able to
Yeah.
is because they're backed by Google.
Yeah.
They're not
And
very profitable either. I mean, a lot of these companies operate on
and so we
operate on
potentially
thin
are running into a
margins.
situation where you're letting Facebook dictate speech for the entirety of the internet. like
You know, I think
like
that's a good idea.
um yeah, it's such a weird mess. And like
Mark
personally for
Zuckerberg's a
me,
good guy.
like I do think that there are a lot of issues as far as like Facebook's power over speech. Like we've seen how they've done these tests for algorithms and been able to manipulate people into certain emotions by just changing the order of things within their feed, for example. That was something they did a while back, and like
Yeah.
this shows how much power they have, and they're using algorithms in really sketchy ways sometimes. But I feel like the solution when you have a monopoly over speech, because it's a private platform, is to break up the monopoly. Like Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, all owned by one
Yeah.
place, and Facebook is exerting more control over all of these social media platforms. So isn't the solution to just not allow one company to have so much control?
I would assume so, but
Yeah.
instead of just kind
And
of keep
like
buying other
a good
things
way
out,
to
I mean,
a good way to do
that's
that,
what the
even if you
company
don't want to break
does.
up companies, and this is something that's been discussed more and more, introduce data ownership. If I want to take my data that I had on Facebook and move it to another
Yes.
platform, that makes it a lot easier to move to a new social media service, which makes competition easier.
That is a big deal.
And
And that's what we want. We want more competition. I mean, in order to have
yeah,
the kind of open internet
like
work, we need a level of competition. And like there isn't right now. Like the only reason Twitter's successful is because it's a different
yeah,
kind of social media than Facebook. You know, we have alternatives to Facebook,
mhm.
and none of them are very big.
And like if
And
you're
it's just like
yeah, and if your concern
people
is
don't
like,
want to
let's say
move.
you are concerned that Twitter is banning just right-wing people. I'm saying that specifically because of the context of how Trump is talking about this. Well, there are
Yeah.
alternatives to Twitter, and if you are concerned about Twitter, well, how nice would it be if you and all of the other people that felt like they were being adversely affected could very easily take your data, migrate it to this other platform, and just be ready to go in a few clicks? Makes it really easy for a
Big
mass
deal. Very
migration
big
if a
deal.
lot of people felt that they were being oppressed. And then you know what that does? If you actually make it so that people own their data, and then you make it so that people, if they remove their data, that data can't be used to profit off of anymore, then it hurts their business. And so they're incentivized to keep all of their customers. And the way to do that would be to ensure that everyone feels like they are being treated fairly. And so you can incentivize fair
Yep.
treatment without also stifling the protections that make these services necessary or like operate. There are ways to do it, and data
Yeah.
ownership
Yeah.
isn't the only one. Breaking up companies isn't the only one. I just use those as examples because it's like instead of destroying the fundamental aspects of the internet, we should be looking at creative solutions to actually deal with the problem. This isn't dealing with the problem; it's just giving the executive authority to police internet speech, pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not
Yeah.
attacking any of the root issues out
Um,
there.
Yeah.
I
And
just
then one last thing I want to
it
mention, there's
it
not really a
bothers me.
lot of details on this, but it's just one of those things that I read that was like, it kind of made me step back for a second because it's not something that I think is going to get talked about even among like policy wonks that are reading this to talk about policy on like a politics podcast or lawyers because there's not a lot of details right now. But
Right.
Section 5 was a little weird to me. So Section 5 of this executive order
Okay.
essentially gives, or it has the attorney general, a federal position overseen by the executive branch, create a group that would enforce potentially state laws pertaining to online platforms, but it also has that group write laws to suggest to states. And so it's just to me a weird thing where, like, and this is something that's not going to affect anything anytime soon, but we are essentially, if this law stands or if this order stands, asking the executive branch, the federal government, to write laws to suggest to states that if states implement, then the federal government would police and enforce, which is just weird because like that's not normally how state laws work.
No, no,
And
that's
it's
not.
also running into an issue of like there's a reason that a lot of state laws pertaining to internet are very limited, and that's because right now the federal government oversees anything that's between state lines. And so that's why, like, you have, for example, California, for those that don't know, has a law where if you can sign up for a service online, you have to be able to cancel it online. And that a lot of places that actually only will show up to cancel online if your account is set to be in California. But if you have the federal government enforcing state laws, then that just seemingly means that
Yeah.
the states could implement a law that would affect the entire nation because the federal government would dictate when they want to enforce it. And so we're running into another weird potential issue. Again, it very much depends on how whatever attorney general at the time decides to enforce it. But a potential issue where, like,
Right.
a state could implement something, like, let's say a small state, Rhode Island, could implement something that then overrides laws in other states because the attorney general wants to implement it, or it just overrides the lack of laws in other states, and then a tiny state could potentially affect the entire country in that way. Like, it's just a weird situation, and
That's
it's
just
something
really
that, like, I'll
weird.
do my best to keep an eye on, like,
Yeah.
specifically just anything that this group does, because I feel like everything this group does is going to be interesting to see potential ramifications. But it's just one of those things where maybe
Yeah.
nothing ever comes from it significantly, but it's just a weird potential power to be giving to the executive branch when it's seemingly supposed to be a state power. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense. I don't know. I don't
It's
know
just
what I
such a
have to
weird
say
thing,
to
yeah.
add to it, but exactly. It's just so weird. Yeah, like I don't.
Yeah, it's odd.
Yeah, that's just odd. I mean, maybe nothing will ever come of it, or maybe people will talk about it enough that we can kind of
Yeah.
monitor it a little closer
Yeah.
to see if anything happens. But
Yeah,
I don't
and
know.
it's
That's
one of those
weird.
things where, like, it just feels like a lot of this feels like they just gave such narrow explanations for things so that they had. Yeah, which
It's
just
a little
means that they are
vague.
giving
Yeah.
themselves more broad powers. Like, if they would have defined this further to specific things, then that would have made more sense and probably would have been fine. But to me,
Yeah.
it's when it's like this very vague definition in an order that is giving power to parts of the government, you're just then giving a broad power. So,
Yeah. Yeah. That's weird.
um,
I don't like it. I don't like extra control being provided to the FCC because they haven't exactly been reliable. So that right there is
yeah,
already a
and
big red
it's
flag for
again, it's
me,
a really
right?
weird thing because the current FCC commissioner doesn't seem like he wants control.
No, he hasn't really done much. He kind of did his first few things, couple good, couple
Yeah, and I
horrible,
mean,
and
like,
then just didn't do anything.
when he
Like
did
after that,
the
he's
net
just been
neutrality
idle.
stuff, it was literally him saying, "We shouldn't police net neutrality. No net neutrality because we're not going to do it. We're backing off. Bye." Like, and that
Yeah,
actually
right,
kind of
right.
screwed them over because,
Yeah,
like,
that's a
if
good
he would
point.
have
It kind
said that
of
we're putting in certain laws or, like, putting in certain regulations pertaining to a lack of net neutrality, it would have required him to do more
yeah,
work, but it would have allowed it to stand better, which is good for us that he didn't. But it's just a weird thing of, like, he accidentally, like, hurt his own policy goal because he seemingly doesn't want to work.
yeah. That's really weird.
So,
I don't know, man. I I I I hope that so let me make sure I understand. Does this what is there that's going to potentially prevent this from becoming law, right? Is what are the hurdles that it has to jump
so
over?
the biggest thing is that ultimately any change to Section 230 being done via executive order is going to get fought because it's changes to a congressional law that was passed by Congress in a bipartisan manner.
Has that been done
I
with
believe so,
executive
but every
orders
time it
before?
gets fought and the whether or not it
Okay.
goes through is based on the context and the constitutionality generally of the original law, rather than
Okay.
the current situation. Like, Trump has used executive orders to try and change the Affordable Care Act, and some stuff has gone through and some stuff has not.
Right.
So it's very much context dependent. I don't really see, personally, with what I know of the law, how it would make sense for the court to say that yes, this executive order makes sense, because it's pretty clear cut how the law laid out broad protections for these businesses. And it's another one of those things where I feel like one of the biggest things the court would have an issue with potentially is that it's allowing the FCC to potentially be the arbiter of good faith rather than the court. And so then that affects every future lawsuit pertaining to anything like this too. So we'll see.
Right. Okay.
The actual final draft of the executive order just came out a couple hours before this, so it's really hard to tell. I'm sure within the next couple of weeks on WordCast we'll do another update with more details and with lawyers having gone through it more, and able to discuss it that way. I know that our Senator Wyden, again, one of the people that wrote the law, or helped write the law, he is obviously very pissed about it, and is already discussing the legality of this order. So we already,
notably angry is what I would like to say.
So we'll see what happens. It also may be possible that certain parts of the order are allowed to stand and others are not. It'll just depend.
Right.
I'm not going to get into court biases or anything, but just it's all going to be messy for a while, and potentially, if this all goes through, we could see some fundamental changes to the internet that could not be very good.
Yeah, mostly negative there, if not entirely.
So,
well, I personally hope it doesn't go through. I don't see a need for it. I don't see a benefit from it. I don't see an argument of the benefit from it. I just see a lot of
and it's like, again, it's one of those things where it's like there are issues at hand, but there are ways to deal with them that don't hurt every other aspect of the internet. And the fact that they are going straight to just the one that gives more power, seemingly pretty sketchy.
Yeah, I don't like that. Well, it's either sketch or lazy, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's one or the other, I feel like.
Yeah. And even if you agree with the current motives of the order, for anyone that's listening to this that, has that opinion, think about the potential future presidents and commissioners and how you want that power to play out, in addition to the ever-growing, continuing power creep of the executive. It's
well, I mean, just the government in general.
But again, like the
just
Congress already, they have a lot of power, but it's also really hard to get things through Congress. And Congress is a lot of people that all have that a significant amount of them have to agree upon something, whereas the executive is ultimately one person with the main control. And while yes, certain people have to be approved by Congress, you could also just fire someone and have a temp person implement the laws you want. And so that is, to me, of greater concern, where most of the power creep that we are seeing is not Congress giving them more power, because in reality they already have most power. They could, if unified, do most what they want. If they wanted to change the Constitution,
that's true.
If enough of them agree upon it and enough states agree upon it, there is already that power. But it's the growing power creep of a singular entity that changes all the time. Yeah.
Or like even a small
group.
And so
it's a running issue of whenever we look at power creep within the executive branch in specific, you have to think, okay, if I agree with the motives of this now, am I going to agree with how this could be used by somebody I disagree with?
Right. And to add to what you were saying about like having states approval and stuff like that, is that doesn't just diversify to a larger number of people that are required to approve of it versus a small tight group plus kind of all the way down to one person. But those people, the state people, are all elected, right? So they have people to answer to a much higher extent than the small cabinet around the president, whatever the president is at the time, right? So either way, it's just like, even if you agree with the motives of it, even if you think it's a good idea, it's not good to give the power in that way. There's other ways to deal with the problem that maybe take longer, maybe aren't as easy, but are going to do a lot better job of not damaging the internet.
And like right now, if you think that Twitter is acting in bad faith, you can sue Twitter and have the courts then look at that situation. There is already currently a process, albeit a little bit of a difficult one, to try and handle those situations. And
well, the point is to be difficult, though, right? Like, you don't want it to be too easy. You don't want it to be up to one person. It needs to be something that's a decision. Like, there's a reason that things take time sometimes and can't be implemented right away or can't be changed right away, is because you need enough people to come to a conclusion that makes sense.
If enough people from one political affiliation, in this case, since we're talking about politics, if one political affiliation all came together and filed some kind of class action against Twitter stating bias, then the court is very likely going to take that up much faster and go through that much sooner, because it is a widespread freedom of speech potential issue.
Right, and that's kind of the idea, is power to the people, and the more people that are interested in a specific change or something like that, the more likely it is to be looked at, and the more power that group has, right? The bigger that group is. And so when you get enough people in agreement with a problem, it's going to be dealt with faster, and it's going to be, but it's going to be dealt with, hopefully, with some level of justice.
And then the other thing that I want to add to this, probably the last thing, since we do need to move on topic-wise, is one of the things that they argue in this is that social media services are like the public square, and therefore there should essentially be no dictation over the speech. However, you know, again, not a lawyer, but like, pretty much every discussion about freedom of speech in every class I took about anything related to government was about how freedom of speech within the Constitution is specifically government retaliation and being arrested and whatnot for your speech. It does not affect anything with how private businesses do anything. And if you think that there needs to be some kind of restriction about how private businesses handle speech, because you think it's, they are essentially a town square as of now, the equivalent of that, then there needs to be new laws discussed about that, not trying to then essentially take a private business and say, you now fall under government laws that were never meant to affect private companies. Like, that's not something that seemingly should be able to be arbitrarily made with an executive order. So that's really the last thing I wanted to add, is just like, they're really just trying to seemingly put the restrictions on how the government handles speech onto private companies without changing the Constitution, despite the fact that the First Amendment is specifically to how the government handles things.